Okay, can you all see that? Can you give me the thumbs up, Dina? Is that okay? Yep, brilliant. Okay, so we have an hour together. Quite a lot to cover. I've unfortunately put a lot into this, so I hope it's not too much. But we will have time for discussion at the end, definitely, as we go as well. So please have your questions and comments ready. I'm going to talk to the topic of top tips for academic writing. It's I think going to be of general applicability to bioethics writing, but I particularly want to focus it in various parts on empirical bioethics, because I know that many of the network members are interested in that kind of way of doing bioethics research, collecting qualitative or quantitative social science data and using that in ethical context. So that's my sort of little bit of a niche coverage as well, and hopefully that will become clearer as I go. I'm going to start by talking about my strategy, how I've gone about setting this talk up. And to be quite honest with you, it's quite a difficult thing, I think, to talk to. And I think there's two reasons for that. I think you're slightly sitting on the horns of a dilemma when you're trying to give people advice on how to write academic papers well. So at one level, one problem I think is that, I could sit here and issue quite generic, quite trite advice on writing clearly, structuring your papers well, the kind of things that I'm sure you already know. But at the other end of the scale, to really provide very detailed, helpful advice to you as individuals, of course, we have to look in very close detail at your projects, your work, and the specific writing that you want to do. And of course, whilst that might be valuable for one or two people, it's not going to be valuable for the entire group. So I had to find a way to sort of navigate between those two poles, I think, in thinking about this. So what I've decided to do is this, and I invite you to listen in and contribute to what I'm calling a confessional tale. It's me confessing my sins as a writer. And it's very much going to be a tale that comprises some hard lessons that I've learned along the way, but within that, hopefully also some useful snippets of information that you could pick up, apply perhaps in your own writing. And my starting point has been this one when I've been thinking about what to cover. What would I have liked to have been told about writing papers by more senior colleagues earlier in my own career, but never was? So with the benefit of hindsight, the things I wish people had told me that in times past would have been helpful, I think, for me to improve my writing skills, to manage difficult situations, to work with journal submissions and such like. Oops, okay. And I'm going to walk you through the process of writing from start to finish. I'm going to focus on academic papers rather than books or thesis writing. But if people do have specific questions about writing a master's or a PhD thesis and the differences, we can discuss that together in the Q&A. I think many of the points are generalizable to other writing activities, but I am going to focus on the idea of submitting and writing papers for journal articles here. And I'm going to give advice essentially as a writer, someone who's published a lot of those papers, but also somebody who sat on editorial boards and has worked as an associate editor managing papers submitted to bioethics journals as well. But here's an initial proviso, and there's a few provisos in this talk. This is very much my experience as a writer and as an editor. And I'm not presuming that everything I say is going to be equally valuable to you as individuals, or it's going to apply to every single piece of writing that you do. And that's really because academic writing in bioethics is such a personal thing, in my view. All papers are unique and all writers are unique. It's partly, I think, a vocation. So some people were just born to write well, I think. I'm not one of those people. I've had to sort of inculcate myself into the spirit of writing, I think. I've written with co-authors. I've sent a draft to a co-author and it's been sent back to me within 3 or 4 hours, and it's been absolutely transformed in its coherence and its elegance and its compelling way in which the points are made. Some people are just really good at writing, and that's okay. You might not be one of the people who's really good, but that's not to say that there aren't elements of the activity that you can pick up. And there are skills involved, I think, particularly in academic writing, rules of the game, things that you can learn, things that you can practice, things that you will become better at over time. It's also, as I put here slightly tongue-in-cheek, a journey into the deepest reaches of your soul. It can be a miserable experience, I think, writing. It can be deeply personally challenging. You can ask some really hard questions about yourself when you're sat there all day failing to produce, failing to get anything done. You learn a lot about yourself, I found, writing anything, but writing academic papers, which is my job, in particular, I think. So I think it's really important to recognize that and to see that as part of the learning points here. I think it's also important to recognize that you can't really write these kinds of papers in bioethics mechanistically. You know, they're not research reports, a bit like perhaps a scientific report might be. You can't just take a skeleton and flesh it out with the same kinds of materials. Each paper's going to be telling its own story in its own unique way, and it needs care and attention, I think, because of that. In my view, success is about recognizing your strengths and weaknesses here and responding to them in the proper kind of way. So here's an opening question for you, just so it's not just a one-way conversation. Use the chat box as we go, if you would like. Ask questions, put points in for discussion, and start now if you'd like to do so. So, you know, an opening question to you: what would you like to know, or what particular worries do you have about the process of writing or publishing papers in empirical bioethics? Dina's going to keep a bit of an eye on the chat as we go, and if there's any points that come up, I'll try and respond to those in real time. If not, we'll come to them at the end, and we'll pick anything up together. But I do want us to be, you know, responsive to your concerns as network members. So please do get stuck in. So here's what I'm going to cover. Four sections essentially to my talk. As I said, walking you through the writing journey. I'm going to start with some points about the context in which we write. How do we decide what to write? That might seem like an easy set of questions, but I think there's some important institutional and contextual considerations to bear in mind, particularly for people in the early stages of their careers in academia. I'm going to spend most of my time on the second section. This is the writing process itself. And a couple of questions I'm going to pick up. I'm going to pick up more than two, but there's a couple of main questions to pick up here. How should you go about writing these kinds of papers? And given that many of these papers are written collaboratively or co-authored, how might you best work in a team to draft a paper in empirical bioethics? I'll move towards the end of the presentation to talk about a couple of smaller sections. The submission process of your papers. What should you consider before and during the submission process? And the inside track as an editor, what might the editors be looking for and how should you engage with them in that process? And then finally, some observations about how to manage the outcome of what the final decision is on your paper and how to navigate a set of responses to that outcome as well. Okay, that's the structure of the talk. Let's start with the writing context. I'm going to start with some good news. There's a lot of data that shows that it's comparatively easy to publish papers in bioethics journals. So if you contrast the acceptance rates of bioethics journals to, let's say, leading law journals or leading philosophy journals, leading social science, leading science journals, they're much higher. Yeah, the best journals in the field in bioethics have acceptance rates of about 20 to 40%. You're looking at less than 5% for many of the top journals in other disciplines. So you have a comparative advantage just to start with in that sense. And here's another important point for the global health bioethics community. And this is something that we experience quite a lot in our own editing work for the Journal of Medical Ethics, which I was involved in. We're acutely aware that there's a dominance in the journals in bioethics in the West. You know, most submissions that get published are from the UK, the US, and Australia. And people want to change that. Editors are very committed to broadening and widening the geographical base of the papers published. So again, you have an advantage if you're writing from the global health context. Your paper will be seen as worthy of special consideration just for that reason. That's a good argument, in my view, to tackle some structural disadvantages, an argument against triple blinding, in fact, that editors don't know who the authors are, because I think there are structural disadvantages facing scholars in certain parts of the world here. There's also, I think, in bioethics, a wide range of opportunities to publish. And you should, if you're in the junior phases of your career, capitalize on these, in my view. So you know, it's not just original papers that publish your primary empirical or philosophical work that are being considered. There are sections of journals that focus on teaching and training. There are sections of journals that focuses on responses and commentaries. Indeed, there's a whole journal like American Journal of Bioethics that invites open peer commentaries, very short, very lightly peer-reviewed pieces. that are a very easy way to contribute to a debate as someone who's new to the field, perhaps, but also not too demanding of time or energy, and a publication, that you can put on your CV. So I do think it's important, for people who are thinking about building up a portfolio of publications, fleshing out their CVs, to look broadly at these opportunities and not just focus on the original research pieces in the journals. Okay, and now a few points I want to make just about this idea of the situatedness of our writing activities. So it's quite right when you're early in your career as a graduate student or postdoc or somebody who perhaps is just testing out their interest in bioethics projects, that you are primarily focused on writing papers that come out of that project work that you're doing. Your PhD, your research fellowship, your what do they call them in the GHBN? Is it the bursary projects? I think they're called something like that. The mini projects that get funded to do a little piece of research. You're invested in those. They're the primary focus of your attention. But for better or worse, the politics of academia also means being sensitive to the broader context of your writings and the institutional demands that places on you, and what that means for your future career trajectory. You do have to think a little bit strategically, I think, about where you're based and what the expectations are in that context. And that's particularly interesting for bioethics, I think, because whilst it's an interdisciplinary field, typically, certainly in the UK, but also I think in other parts of the world too, bioethics centres, people, institutes are located usually within a single discipline department. And the people who run those departments and pay your salary will have their own expectations and accountability requirements that they place upon you. Sometimes you don't know what they are until you start being told off for not doing the right kinds of things, but it is important to try to get a sense of those and be responsive to them, I think, when you're thinking about prioritising your writing activities. To give you a couple of examples, I work in the medical sciences department. Ethox and the Wellcome Centre is based in the Nuffield Department of Population Health. A colleague of mine had a proposal to write a book that summarised a lot of their work over the last few years. And the head of the department turned around and said, "Why on earth would you waste your time writing a book? Get writing papers." Yeah, so there's a sense in which if you're the kind of person who wants to write a book, a bioethics book, if you're in a medical sciences department, there may be good reasons why that will be looked unfavourably and you might not want to choose that option. In contrast, making sure some of your publications feature in medical or science journals is typically seen as a positive thing and something that will raise your profile, I think, as a junior scholar in those departments. Medical sciences departments also tend to publish people tend to publish lots and lots of papers. And I certainly feel under pressure to publish more than I perhaps feel comfortable with sometimes because of that institutional context. I can't get away with publishing one really good paper every 2 years. That's just not going to fly with the people who review my work and continue to pay me if I want to stick around. So you have to adhere to those conventions, I think. And they're reversed in other departments. Again, many bioethics centres are based in philosophy departments or law departments. Their books, monographs are valued. In fact, they're seen as a key mechanism for career advancement. So you may want to be prioritising a book over and above a number of papers, for example. There's often an expectation you'll publish not just in bioethics specific journals, but also the law or philosophy journals that those departments recognise as being of particular value. And I think we might also reverse that quantity versus quality balance perhaps in those departments as well. They're less worried about how much you publish, just the things you publish are of the correct quality and in the right disciplinary venues. Okay, let's move now on to the writing process. That's the context done and dusted. Let's move on to the actual process. And this is the key question and the hardest bit, I think. How do you go from the initial germ of a good idea to a polished final paper? That's the question we're all worried about. It's the question we're all focused on. And I think it's the one that deserves the most attention. Again, there's no single proceduralized route to that destination from the start. It depends on a whole range of things. We have to be aware and responsive to this. Depends on what you're writing about, first and foremost. What that journey is going to look like depends on the kind of car you're in, I guess. it fundamentally depends on how you write, your personality as a writer, how you get things done, how you personally can write well, how you balance that with your competing obligations that you have in your roles. And it can take a long time to find that balance, to learn what works best for you. Don't worry about that. It's a learning process, and you'll only get better over time, in my view. Also depends on who you're writing with and their personalities and expectations as well, of course, but also what the final product will be. So it's a very different thing to write an open peer commentary of 1,000 words versus a monograph of 70,000 words. There's a very different product. They require a whole different range of planning and preparation, of course. But I'm going to take academic papers for bioethics journals as my focus on this writing process. Firstly, of course, it's really important to recognize that bioethics is an interdisciplinary field. You may write different kinds of papers. A philosophical ethical analysis of a practical ethical problem will look very different as a paper and will place different demands on you in your planning, your delivery, to an empirical bioethics paper on perhaps a similar topic. So I know people here are interested in empirical bioethics in particular, so I'm going to focus for reasons of time on that particular type of contribution. But to break this question down, how do you go from an initial germ of an idea for a paper to a polished final product? I want to break it down into a set of more manageable questions for us to interrogate together. And these are the questions, I hope. Yeah. Firstly, what kind of empirical bioethics paper am I writing? And that's important because the project, the nature of what you're trying to achieve in your project will clearly follow right through to how you ought to deliver in the writing process at the end of that project. It's really important that we're clear about what we're trying to convey and what we've delivered on specifically as a piece of empirical bioethics research. Secondly, what is the novel contribution that I'm making to the bioethics knowledge base? And I raise that because I think there is a risk in some empirical bioethics writing that novelty will not be as clear or as strongly made as in the paper that it could be. And one of the strongest and most common reasons for rejecting papers, in my experience, is that it's not clear what that novel contribution actually consists in, or indeed if there is one. Third, the question about structuring a paper. What parts of the paper deserve the most care? How should you manage that structure process? Fourthly, should you be targeting your writing in advance of particular journals? And finally, this knotty set of questions that can arise specifically with co-authorship and the writing together, writing as a group. So let's start with the first question. What kind of empirical bioethics paper am I writing? Now, we could have a whole seminar on the nature of empirical bioethics, of course, and it's a complex subfield of bioethics with lots of dimensions to it. I'm taking it for granted that you know a little bit about empirical bioethics. It doesn't matter if you don't know too much, but I want to give you I want to review some of the basic tenets of that, just so we can understand the kinds of empirical bioethics contributions we can make. My points here are general ones, though. Being successful in publishing these papers means being clear from the start about the kind of empirical bioethics work you're doing, because that will follow through to being clear what the contribution you're making is, and that you don't lose sight about the objectives that you have when you come to writing up that piece of work. It'll help you to remain focused on the task at hand, basically. You'll stay clear about what it is you're doing, and you'll be able to better locate it, I think, in the relevant literature by knowing precisely the kind of contribution you're making. And I make this point because I do think this is a weakness in much of the empirical bioethics work that I come across. It's often when you read some submissions of these kinds of journals, the precise aim of what the researchers have tried to achieve has been kind of unclear or slightly opaque. And so the general message of the paper gets lost. Or people try to shoehorn too many objectives and deliver on those objectives too far in one single paper, perhaps. Always a good lesson to ask yourself is, should I break this piece of work up into 3 papers rather than keep it as one big piece of work? Never feel afraid of saying, actually, there's too much to say here. I should write 2 papers rather than 1. So lots of different ways in which people have tried to sort of give an account about the different kinds of empirical bioethics papers, I want to put forward and review a very simplistic account that I want to just introduce to you. And maybe, in your own work, you can think a little bit about whether your paper fits into one of these types of empirical bioethics or another one. So one type of empirical bioethics paper and project, more broadly, of course, focuses on identifying ethical issues in the real world. And you see a lot of papers of these kinds. They're basically horizon scanning activities. You'll look in perhaps a different geographical location or a particular clinical or research context. What are the distinctive ethical challenges that arise within this particular domain, practice or policy in this place, in this part of the world, perhaps? And that might be on new technology, it might be on a new kind of research practice, it could be a new set of issues that haven't been highlighted before, but you're showcasing things that the bioethicists have not yet analysed. They are genuinely new and interesting because in this very contextualised sense. A lot of work looks like that. Second one seeks to fill out the empirical premises of ethical arguments. So, we might have an argument that says something like, in advance, we should not use advanced directives in healthcare when they comprise patients' well-being, when they reduce patients' well-being. So we should ignore the advanced directives if patients' well-being is reduced when we follow that advanced directive. Let's say that's the argument. And what the empirical bioethicists would do there is they would go and collect data on whether, when the advanced directive was followed, well-being was positively or negatively affected. Essentially, they'll be completing the argument and making it practically useful because they will provide the data that makes that general philosophical claim about advanced directives usable and workable in the real world. You've got the data now that shows you when and how you should be applying that in light of the argument that has been produced. Here, the empirical data comes after the philosophical argument, importantly. In the first one, the data collected to introduce the need for new arguments because we have new issues that need to be argued about, right? The third type of empirical bioethics is evaluative. It examines the ethical arguments or the practical interventions that are introduced in practice on the basis of those arguments to see whether they work as they ought to do. Are our interventions being implemented in the right way on the basis of the ethical argument that motivated them? So, people do lots of evaluation work in community engagement, for example. You might have an argument that says we should engage the community in which we are conducting our research, because in doing so, we will get better informed consent. Now, I'm not defending that argument, it's just an argument to put out there. Now, what you would do in an evaluation piece of research is you would look at whether your community engagement activity actually functioned when introduced to improve the quality of informed consent. So you're evaluating the implementation of a new ethical intervention to see whether the argument that underpinned it is being translated into practice correctly or not. And if you found that it didn't improve informed consent, you would be arguing that that intervention should change so that it better fulfilled the argumentative aims in the first instance. And then fourthly and finally, but certainly not least, we have this thing that I'm interested in, particularly in my work, the full integration of ethical and empirical inquiry, where the purpose is to make practical ethical arguments by using empirical data directly. So what often happens in this kind of research in empirical bioethics is that we'll reason, we'll argue with, we'll develop a space for deliberation with our study participants to consider what arguments should have force in their context in light of their stakeholder investment, perhaps in that context, either as doctors or researchers or patients or as community members of some kind. These will often use quite novel methodologies that treat to integrate social science methods with ethical deliberative strategies. But the key thing going on here is this idea of arguing in context, to bring people together in an interview perhaps or a focus group and to engage in ethical reasoning with them. about the reasons that they have, the arguments they want to put forward, in order to make progress in the right course of action for practice in that context that they're invested in as stakeholders. So 4 different types of empirical bioethics. They'll all, of course, be written up differently. They'll all draw on different literatures to situate themselves in the context of the field. They'll all make very different claims in their discussions and conclusions. The findings will be used to showcase different things. It's very helpful, I think, to be absolutely clear before you start writing. What have we sought to do in our project, and what have we found in light of that aim? Because you won't be doing all 4 of these things. You might be doing 1 or more of them at different stages, but it's more likely you're doing just 1 of them in your project. So get clear on what that is. And that will really help to streamline and remain and keep your writing focused and delivering what you've done. Okay. Let's move on to the second point, second question. How can you articulate the novel contribution you're making? Because that's going to be key to getting your paper published. So regardless of the type of empirical bioethics project you're undertaking, you have to convince the editors this is new and distinctive. Never lose sight of that. That's your selling point. Bear with my PowerPoint, sorry. It's a bit slow, there we go. So here, ask yourself the question before you start to write. What new and important insight am I trying to convey in my paper? Don't lose sight of that as you keep writing the different sections. Always hark back to it. Always make sure that each section of the paper serves that question. And once again, don't be too ambitious. Don't try to shoehorn too many new insights into one paper. That's just going to be confusing. You'll lose the core message. Here's a really important point for bioethics publishing, bioethics journals. You must be able to convince the editors, I think, in my view, that your contribution, your novel contribution, is a contribution to our ethical understanding. That is to say, to the ethics knowledge base. It's quite possible that your empirical ethics study might make more of a contribution to the social science literature than the ethics literature. That's absolutely fine. You know, empirical bioethics sits between those 2 fields in an important sense. You may decide that the bioethics journal is not the best place for your paper to be published or submitted. You may think it's better published in a health social science journal, for example. But if you are targeting a bioethics journal, you'll want to convince the editor that it contributes to our ethical understanding. And in my experience as an editor, most rejections by the editor before review are made on this kind of grounds. Yes, there's some interesting new empirical data in this paper, but it doesn't substantially change or enrich our understanding of the broader ethical questions that the author is focusing on. Let's think about how that might play out, how that kind of problem might arise. I'm going to give a couple of examples to illustrate this. These are not real examples, they're examples I've made up, but they are, in some sense, typical of the kinds of problems that sometimes can arise in my experience. So let's imagine we've got a paper that presents interview data, and that interview data sheds light on the ethical issues that arise for researchers undertaking genomics research in Japan. Bear with me, it's a bit slow. Come on. There we go. So I think to have a decent chance of being published, this paper would have to do one of the following 2 things. It doesn't have to do both of them, but it would have to do one of these 2 things. To show the Japanese context and this particular study, through revealing that context, demonstrates some new insight into the distinctive ethical issues that haven't been characterized in the literature previously, perhaps in studies done in the UK or Africa or North America, wherever it might be. There's something genuinely new about the challenges in doing genomics research that have come about in this project. Or perhaps, if the issues aren't themselves new, that the ways in which the issues present themselves open up the possibility for a different direction for our ethical analysis of those issues to be studied in the future, that we change the tone or the direction of that ethical analytic debate. that would be a reason to publish that, because it would, you would think, stimulate further ethical reflection on some really interesting ways in which, let's say, consent problems can arise in genomics research that haven't been studied before, even if we already knew that that research can throw up consent problems. However, if the paper just presented a Japanese perspective on the issues that really have been explored and examined and showcased elsewhere, all you've got is some new knowledge about how the Japanese researchers have the same problems other people have, it's going to be difficult to publish that in a bioethics journal, in my experience. Let's take another example. Here we have a paper that presents some survey data on doctors in Croatia, their views and practices concerning informed consent. And that paper reveals that their views and practices fail to adhere to well-established ethical principles or guidelines. And for the authors in their discussion and conclusion, that's an important ethical problem that needs to be addressed, perhaps through better training, a common conclusion to papers of those kinds. So again, to have a decent chance of being published, I think the paper would need to show either that the Croatian context reveals distinctive practices or views around why consent is not appropriate, perhaps that opens up the possibility that we don't need to get informed consent in all cases, and that these views and experiences reveal something problematic about the ways in which we standardly think about obtaining informed consent in medicine. Or that the views that Croatian doctors present legitimate challenges to established norms, such as actually the recommendations are that the guidelines or the ways in which principles in the guidelines are codified is problematic in contexts like these. That's the kind of thing that really feels like a weighty, novel contribution. But if the paper simply concludes that Croatian doctors don't do as they should do in light of well-recognized norms or practices when they get consent, again, interesting to know that Croatian doctors struggle in that way, but we already know that people struggle in those ways, I would expect. And so it's going to be difficult to justify publication again. Okay, let's move on. Structuring a paper. So, it's entirely legitimate, I think, when you're doing empirical bioethics research, to adopt norms that are usually used in the social sciences and the sciences. So, you'd expect a rewriting these kinds of papers, I think, by reference to an introduction, a methodology, a findings, a discussion, and a conclusion. That wouldn't be possible, it wouldn't be appropriate for philosophical bioethics papers, but it's entirely legitimate and I think quite appropriate to do that in empirical bioethics. And you'll see that happening all the time in the literature that you come across, I'm sure. In my view, the introduction and the discussion are the key sections. Not interested in the findings. The findings have to be interesting. That's the new data and it's actually grabs your attention. But it's not going to be, I think, the critical place where you convey the distinctive and novel contribution you're making. I think it's these two sections where the most work needs to be put in. The introduction provides and carves out that space for the need for your paper. You've got a rationale for why there's a huge gap in the literature and your wonderful piece of work is about to fill it. That, I think, is the stage where you do most of that reading, because to carve out that gap, of course, you're going to have to be able to show the gap through the literature review that will form part of that section of the paper. And then the discussion provides the opportunity where you, I think, will connect your empirical insights to this wider ethical analytic state of play. And once again, common reason for empirical bioethics papers to be rejected by bioethics journals is because the discussion doesn't have enough so-called ethics in it. I've seen that being said many a time. So, how does this new data change the field of bioethics, the ethical interrogation of the problems that you're interested in? What new avenues for bioethical reflection have you opened up? What new arguments are you presenting to that literature yourself, perhaps, if you're doing a kind of empirical bioethics that makes new arguments as well? Again, I think this is where you're going to be doing more reading. You're going to be reading the broader, you're going to connect that work to the broader landscape. You want to make sure that you connect that up in the right kind of way and you demonstrate this sort of space for contribution and future direction in that literature. But it is important in the discussion section that you contextualize and you connect it up to the broader ethics scholarship. Okay. So I said I was dubious about generic advice on writing papers right at the start, but I do think there is a paper that I think is actually very useful on how to structure papers in academic writing generally. I've put the reference there. Hope Dina will share these slides afterwards. It's more oriented towards scientific paper writing, but there's some really good general lessons in there. So if you are really basically new to this and you're terrified by how to structure the paper, that is a helpful article to look at, I think, as well. But be aware, it's not bioethics specific. Okay, should I write for a particular journal, with a particular journal in mind? People often ask this question. In my view, the answer is yes. But perhaps don't become too fixated on one single journal, because of course it might not get accepted. I think it's useful to have perhaps a plan A and a plan B in mind. You may not decide which is the first priority, which is the second priority. Have a couple of papers in mind when you're writing. And there are obvious reasons why that's important. Journals have different and quite strict expectations in terms of their style, but also their word length. There's no point starting to draft a very long paper when the journal you want to get it published in is ultimately going to be half the length. You're going to set yourself up for a real set of problems later down the line if you do that. So you need to know approximately the kind of length of your paper is going to have to be to get to the journals you might want to publish it in. Also, don't forget that bioethics journals have quite distinctive orientations. This is sometimes quite implicit rather than explicit, but you can grasp a little bit about reading the blurb on their websites. So nursing ethics, JME, more practice orientated, healthcare analysis, more policy orientated, some more theoretical, bioethics, Cambridge Quarterly, and importantly, I think for the global health community, bioethics community, some more receptive to issues in certain contexts, developing world bioethics, global bioethics, obviously, but also some of them are more geographically orientated. There's no point submitting a UK-based analysis on UK policy to an American journal or an Australian journal. They do have orientations because of their geographical heritage in that way. But the most important reason why I think you need to be writing for a particular destination and think about that in advance is because not all papers, not all journals in bioethics are equally receptive to empirical bioethics papers. And a very interesting study by Wang Mo et al. In 2018, which reviewed the location of empirical research in the field, showed, among other things, that almost 90% of empirical ethics papers were published in only 2 journals. JME and nursing ethics. Now, I want to just qualify that study a little bit because they missed out a few journals. They only took 9 journals. There's many more than 9 journals. And there's a couple of things that I think are missing for our lessons here. BMC medical ethics has grown a lot in the last few years, and it's become a kind of go-to destination for empirical bioethics studies, so that shouldn't be forgotten. And no global health bioethics specific journals were included. And again, I think you would see more of an orientation towards empirical ethics pieces in those types of journals too. So take that study with a pinch of salt, but it is an interesting insight into the fact that not all journals are made equally for empirical bioethicists at least. Okay, moving on. Don't want to talk for too much longer. Writing with co-authors. A large proportion of bioethics papers are co-authored. It's particularly true for empirical bioethics papers, and this can be particularly challenging in its own right. Here's some issues that I've encountered. It's really important when you're co-authoring to get clear from the start on the division of labour. Who's going to write it and how? Is it going to be one person who leads, or will different people write different sections? There are pros and cons of each, and I can talk about that in the discussion if that will be helpful. Importantly, is the agreed division of labour fair, or are the senior people dumping all the hard writing work on the most junior person? Do not be afraid to push back. You know, it is important that people pull their weight when they are authoring a paper. And I would expect every person to be involved in drafting in some cases. Perhaps not drafting substantially, perhaps rewriting bits and pieces in the paper, but it's not fair to constantly expect the most junior person to do the first draft and then for the more senior people to add a veneer on the top of it. I feel quite strongly about that. It does happen quite a lot, even in bioethics. Moving on, come on. Agree authorship protocols in advance. It can be politically sensitive to understand who's going to be where on a paper in terms of the author list, and people not feeling clear on whether their contribution merits authorship or not. It's really important to know how that's going to work. Does adding a mere set of comments to a paper qualify you as authorship? In my view, no, not in most cases. And I'd expect the person who was authoring the paper to be rewriting in light of their comments, not just adding a comment. So it's important that people set those rules together and there's an agreement on them. But otherwise, you will fall out with people, potentially, if you're not careful. Be sensitive to timeframes and expectations. People will have limited time. There may be certain weeks where a person can join in with their writing. So when you're co-authoring, you don't have that kind of flexibility to be a bit lazy or to be a bit more slapdash. You do have to be a bit more planned, I think, in how you set out the timing of the writing process. If you're not the lead author, manage the politics of investment carefully. I do think it's helpful for the lead author to have primary ownership. And one problem that can arise is other authors constantly wanting the paper to take a different direction. I think it's important to recognize that strategically, if you're not the lead author, or perhaps the senior author as well, you do have to step back a little bit from the intellectual investment you have. And if you don't agree, you have the opportunity to pull out, of course, of the paper, but you can't keep pushing against the views of the dominant authors, in my view, in this. It will cause a whole range of difficulties if that goes on. So sometimes it's okay to say, I'm not completely invested in this paper, there might be other papers that I'm leading, and that's fine. As I said, you might disagree ultimately with what the paper says, particularly if it makes new ethical arguments. You might have to drop out of a paper, and I've seen that happen many times in papers I've been involved in. Sometimes people have dropped out and written a kind of response piece to the main paper that was being written. Don't be afraid to say, I'm sorry, I just don't feel able to commit to the final conclusions this paper has come to. I need to withdraw. Nobody will think bad of you about that as long as you handle it in the right kind of way. The submission process. Basic points here we can cover quite quickly. Road test your ideas. Hugely important, particularly for junior scholars. It can be difficult to know when your draft is finished. I've never written a primary research paper in less than 5 drafts. Co-author papers tend to require more because it goes backwards and forwards between so many more people. Get feedback from as many sources as you can. Give seminars on your paper early in the paper's drafting and later. Do them internally and externally. Make use of your networks like this one, your mentors, your supervisors. And a quick tip on giving seminars when you're writing a paper, in the process to improve the writing of a paper. It can be difficult sometimes when you're giving a paper, answering questions, to remember what points are being made, even though you want to refer back to them when you come to redrafting. So perhaps ask somebody in the audience to make a note of all the comments so you can remember them. When it comes to submission itself, get the editors on side. Now, the editors are human beings, yes, but the submission process for most journals now is heavily systematized and outsourced. So you've got to play by the rules, because there's not going to be a human being who's an academic who's going to be responsive to the reasons why your paper needs to be 2,000 words longer than the word limit. It'll just be sent back by the non-academic assistant. You've got to adhere to those requirements now because you don't have that kind of direct contact with the editors that you used to have. Don't forget that the editors are not as invested in your work as you are, that they're very busy people, maybe managing 50 papers at one time. It's not their full-time job, and they're the ones who decide things, not the reviewers. Now, of course, they'll typically go along with the reviewers' recommendations, but not always. I've seen situations where reviewers have given positive reviews, but the editors have decided to reject the paper regardless. Even more rarely, I've seen situations where the reviewers have given negative reviews, recommended rejection, and the editors have wanted to proceed with the paper and give the opportunity for revision. So the editors make the final decision. They're the ones you've got to work with and convince and get on side, not the anonymous reviewers. Now, with pros and cons to that view, but that is the way it is. They have a lot of power in changing the direction of the field. So you've got to make their lives as easy as possible. In my opinion and my experience, the abstract you write is much more important than the cover letter. Cover letters hardly ever get read, or they get read in a very cursory fashion. The abstract, on the other hand, is key. It's your first chance to convince a busy editor that you're saying something new and interesting. So give really careful thought to it and make it clear in the abstract what your main claim is, what your argument is that supports that claim, and why it's important. It's not all they're going to read, of course, they're going to read the whole paper, but that's your first opportunity to be able to think, okay, yeah, looks like there's something in this. For better or worse, many editors will dismiss a paper or at least be skeptical about its potential because the abstract has not convinced them. Always give names of recommended reviewers if you can. It's hugely difficult to find reviewers these days. I've been through situations where I had to go through 15 people to find 2 reviewers. It's getting harder as academic work becomes more intense. Editors always use these reviewers' recommendations. It's your opportunity to get somebody you want reviewing it to review it. It will be used. It's not just ignored. And finally, the outcome. So let's start with the positive outcomes first. Be aware, of course, it's almost unheard of, but certainly rare, to get an immediate acceptance from both reviewers and from the editor from your first submission. So, you're going to get invited at best to revise the paper. You should be absolutely overjoyed if you get a minor or major revisions decision. That means you've got a little bit of work to do, perhaps a bit more work to do for some major revisions, but your paper is on the route to acceptance. A revise and resubmit outcome, which some journals have, sometimes they just call that major revisions, or it'll be a sort of really major revision, sometimes the editor will explain that. That's also positive. Yes, you might have to make some quite radical changes, but the key thing is the editors have bought into your paper. They're on your side, they want you to succeed. They can see a route to the paper being published. And so it's a good outcome, even if the final redraft is quite significantly different in light of the comments you've received. Be aware that the editors will often add their personal comments to those of the reviewer. People sometimes miss these, but in many ways they're the most important. What the editor says about how you should interpret the reviewer's comments or additional things that they would like to see are in some senses the most critical because they're the people who make the final decision. So don't miss those, and sometimes they can be missed because they're in a different part of the body of the decision letter sometimes. When you come to resubmit, major or minor or revise and resubmit, the response to reviewer's document is critical. You must respond to every single point made by the reviewers and the editor in turn, and I would lay them out in that way. Point, response, point, response, point, response. You don't have to agree with every point, nor make every change the reviewer has asked for, but you must, if you don't make that change, explain why you haven't done so. You can push back, but you need a good reason to convince the editor that that makes sense. But don't push back too far, I think. If you were to reject and push back against every single point made by a reviewer or both reviewers, that's probably one of the only surefire ways to turn a major revision decision into a rejection. And finally, my final slide, when the outcome is less than positive. So we have to face the reality here, and it is a tough reality. Most papers are going to be rejected. That's a fact of life. And as bioethics grows, but the number of journals and issues doesn't increase in response, many more papers will be rejected, and many more will be rejected immediately by the editors without peer review. As with every other aspect of academic life, rejection is a failure. Failure is a reality. And how you deal positively and productively with having a paper rejected is critical, I think, both for your personal well-being, but also for your career trajectory. My advice would be this: if you get comments back when it's been rejected, and you usually will, even if it's just from the editors, don't put them to one side, read them carefully, do make revisions in light of those comments where helpful in your view, and resubmit it straight away. Within 2 weeks is my advice. And I've been burnt on this before. After my PhD, I had 3 papers, all of which were rejected. And I didn't resubmit them in good time. And there was 25,000 words of papers on my hard drive now from 12 years ago. Now, way too late to do anything with because the data's so old. But I could have turned those around in 2 weeks and got that work out there. It would have been accepted somewhere. I wouldn't have had to do too much work to get it published. 25,000 words of time and effort and energy and new insight, in my view, wasted. So don't fall into the trap that I fell into at that point. And finally, you can appeal a rejection at most journals, at least. So you can say to the editor, I want to appeal that you've rejected my journal. And it can be successful. The editors take these very seriously. You have to explain either why the editors or the reviewers have misinterpreted your paper or where the review process has been substandard. Ultimately, it's an academic judgment call, and you can only go so far. You don't want to keep pushing back because you're going to annoy people if you do that. But editors will be responsive to well-reasoned claims that the reviewer has been inadequate or something critical has been missed or you've been unfairly treated in the review process. But be professional. And I have seen situations where authors have been blacklisted by journals, i.e. not further considered for any future papers because of abusive behavior toward editors after rejection. Perhaps surprisingly, isn't an uncommon thing. Editors get a lot of abuse, or they get snide remarks or such like from unhappy authors quite frequently. Don't be one of those people. It can get you into trouble. Good, so I'm there. I know I've gone slightly longer than I'd hoped to go, but I'm looking forward to our discussion. And of course, I'm always available for questions and comments or individual chats if you'd like to do so. So just get in touch with me. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Mikey. My goodness, there was a lot of good stuff there. So there are several questions in the chat. So I know that we're coming up close on time, but we'll try to get through them all. Just first, several people have asked me that if the slides can be shared. Is that's okay? Will you send me a copy of the slides to share with everyone?
Absolutely. I'm also happy to stay for 10 minutes longer if people want to have more time to ask the questions. If they can stay, I can certainly stay. So I don't have to rush off in 5 minutes. So I'm more than happy to spend a bit more time with people if we want to spend more time here.
Okay, that's great. So let me just scroll back up through the comments. I think the first question that was asked was mine, but I'm going to skip over that because I'd rather you respond to other people's questions. So the second question was asked by Paulina. Paulina, if you're still here, Paulina was saying, choosing the right journal to publish a bioethics paper when the audience is biomedical scientists, what should inform your choice of journals?
That's a great question. I've been really unsuccessful, Paulina, in getting my papers published in scientific journals or medical journals in the past. I just don't write the kind of thing I guess that people want to hear. I think it's hard. I think you have to be quite careful when it comes to publishing in science or biomedical science or medical journals. That's largely because many of the editors will just not quite know what your paper is trying to do or where it will fit. One of the key things I think to consider there is there a section type, a type of paper articulated in the information for authors on the journal's website, which is not for scientists, right? So, for example, the Lancet and the BMJ have an analysis section, and that's the place where bioethics would have success. So I think the critical question about what journal choice you go for if you want to publish in a science journal is there a clear type of category of paper that you can convince the editor your paper fits into? Because many of them will see and think, oh, that's not a sub piece of science, not for us. So you've got to be able to sort of convince them that it's a natural fit in one of the sections of their journal. And I think it's also key to look at the journals which have previously published bioethics research. And many of these leading science and medical journals are not blinded anymore. And that's come with, I think I've observed an issue, which is that usually it's the leading figures in the field who get success in those journals. And that's a real problem. But you want to be looking for places where I think bioethicists doing similar work to you have had success previously. The good thing about these science journals, they usually get a much quicker rejection from them. So you can try a few and you don't waste too much time. You don't have to wait 6 months to be rejected. I remember at the BMJ, I once had a paper rejected by an editor within 3 hours of submitting it. So, you're treated harshly, but with respect in terms of your time. So, you can have a go at a few. But I think the key question is, do they have a history of publishing papers of this kind, and is there a natural place in the journal for the contribution?
All right, thanks, Mikey. Is that all right with you, Paulina?
Yes, please. Thank you very much, Mikey.
Thanks, Paulina. Good to see you as well. It's been a long time.
Right. The next question was posed by Tom. He says, what kind of compromise, if any, should one with a philosophy background be ready to make in order to meet writing expectations in a medical department context?
Thanks, Tom. That's a fascinating question. I think a lot of compromises is the answer. And I think many people in bioethics who are philosophers by background would say they already make quite a few compromises when they write philosophically in bioethics compared to other areas of philosophy. But the truth of the matter is, and this might not be just about your boss or the people who govern your department. It might be about how your institution grades your research for national research assessment exercises, for example. If you're being submitted in a medical context, you have to be able to speak to those requirements. I think what it means largely is being open to the possibility of reining in some of the philosophy. It's being open to the possibility of joining in with empirical work and being open to that, recognizing what you as a philosopher can add that's distinctive to a paper writing exercise. It's about learning the abilities to communicate clearly and well with scientists, about being responsive to their problems, I think. But more than anything, it's just about, I think, working the philosophy for the context, and I guess if you're already interested in bioethics, you already are interested in that practical context in a particular kind of way. Not all philosophers can do that or want to do that. It does require some changes. And it's about learning the kind of politics, I think, and interpersonal exchange and expectations in your department. Don't be afraid to ask people, what are your expectations of me as a philosopher coming into this setting? What should I know about what you expect of me? I come from a different setting. So that's an entirely reasonable question to ask. So it's a great question, though.
Tom, do you have any follow-up, or does that answer your question?
I'm grateful for the insight.
I'm not a philosopher, Tom, so I'm probably not the best person to ask, but there are many philosophers around Oxford who can help you with that, who work in medical sciences. So I'll put you in touch with people if you want to have a chat.
Thank you, Prof.
All right, now let me keep going. So, okay, so there's a question about some of the examples you used in your slides. It says, if the papers you made examples with don't make enough of a novel contribution to be accepted in ethics journals, would you say they could be accepted in social science journals? That's from Manono.
Manono, absolutely yes. And I think the tricky thing for the empirical bioethicist is that they are sitting between different fields. They're sitting between usually social sciences and ethics. And it's important to ask yourself, I think, as you go through your research, but also your writing, am I making a contribution that's more social science in character or more ethics in character? And it will depend a bit on the type of empirical ethics you're doing, I think, as well. Absolutely it is. You might think this offers really new sociological insight into the practices around medical research in this context. And a social science journal, I'm sure, will be glad to receive it. My point is just not to treat the bioethics journals like they're social science journals. I do think that the editors will often be asking, for those of us who are not social scientists or empirically minded, but are more philosophically minded, what does this paper offer me and the ethical debate on this topic? So just bear that in mind. It's not a guarantee, But of course, you always have the social science route to go back to if that's what you think is most appropriate. And it's not, fail to get into a bioethics journal and you're in trouble. It's that you have an entirely different other field where I'm sure would be more receptive to it. But it's about working out where you sit and the best kind of way of understanding the contribution that you make.
Thanks. Manono, does that help you?
Yes, it's very helpful. Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Dina.
All right, great. I see another question here from Irene. She says, how old is old? After collecting data, after how long is it no longer feasible to submit a paper?
That's a great question. There'll be lots and lots of debate about that. There's not going to be a single answer. I don't think, if old was too old, there'd be whole fields of inquiry where data archival data would be suddenly rendered illegitimate. So it's going to depend entirely on what you can convince the reader and the editor about. So quite obviously, I'll give you my own example. So my data is 12 years old. The law has changed. So it's actually data that speaks to something that's now completely out of date in terms of the practice environment in which I was studying. So it's no longer rendered useful or informative. But of course, if that's not the case, it's entirely possible that 10-year-old data could be still really valuable and informative. But you would expect, I think, the editors and the reviewers to pick that up and say, this data is now very old. How can I be convinced it's still relevant? And it would require a response. I think if you did have data that was more than 2 or 3 years old, you'd want to be acutely aware of that, perhaps see it as a limitation, but if not, explain why it's still valuable and relevant. Don't leave it too long, not least because you'll lose interest in writing it up. That's the bigger problem, I think, most of the time. It's that you move on to something else. That's what messed me up with my previous writing. It wasn't that I lost interest in it wasn't that I didn't want to write them up anymore. I thought it was invaluable. I just was working on something else and couldn't find time or energy to do it. Hence why it's important to do it quickly in resubmission terms. But no, data can always be valid for a long time, but just as long as you can convince the reader that's the case. Sorry.
Great. Irene, was that good for you, or did you want to ask anything else? Great. Okay, thumbs up from Irene. All right. I skipped over another question from Tom. Tom, you had a second question about the importance of the abstract. Do you want to still ask that question, or did Mikey kind of answer it in his presentation?
He touched on it, so I think that gives me an idea. He touched it towards the end of the presentation, so I'm happy to go with that. I'm grateful.
Thanks, Tom. I guess to put it in a summary point, the abstract is your marketing strategy. It's where you get the person who first encounters your paper on your side, and think of it like that. That's why it's important. It's the hook for everybody to buy into your work, including the editors.
Yeah, that's a good way of describing it. I see Samantha has her hand up.
Thank you, Dina. Thank you, Michael, for a very informative presentation. My question is mainly on authorship, because sometimes as a junior researcher, you feel obliged to include an author because they are senior and probably they did much funding to the project, so maybe their name should be included in the paper. But then there are also instances whereby these senior researchers, they add in their colleagues into the paper. And as a junior, sometimes you wonder, how much did they contribute to my paper, and how best can I be able to push back and say, no, maybe this person should not be in it. It's really complicated when it comes to authorship as a junior researcher. How best can you advise?
It is hard, and there's still a lot of bad practice around this that takes place. My sense it's not quite so bad in bioethics as in the medical sciences, for example, but I think we still do encounter it even in bioethics. it is important to be realistic, right? So you are a junior scholar, and you know, if you want to be a successful academic and you want to progress with your career, you do have to keep the right people on side. So it is important not to put yourself in a vulnerable position in ways that could scupper the development of your career. But it is not acceptable to be doing that, clearly. And you know, it's not that that's a sort of a debated view. There are international guidelines that all journals have committed themselves to that clarify precisely what it means to count as an author. And even I, you know, encounter this with colleagues in Oxford who expect things when actually, you know, there's strict reading of that guideline, they wouldn't count, right? I don't think just adding a comment to the margin of the text counts. You are expected to be drafting, to be writing parts of the paper. And that's clear. Now, how do you handle it when this happens? It does depend on your situation. I'm not advocating that you take on the senior person that you work with. But that doesn't mean you have to suffer in silence either. I think, you know, I think one of the opportunities here is to find a neutral but equally powerful person to speak to. I've seen that happen before with some positive results. This is somebody who you don't work with directly and isn't an author on the paper as well, I think, importantly, but might be the head of department, might be somebody else in a senior position in your academic setting, and ask them if they will be able to intervene, perhaps neutrally, with the person concerned. Now, again, that will depend a bit on the politics of that setting, and you might not yourself feel comfortable to do that. There's no obvious solution to this problem aside from constantly reiterating the importance of those guidelines. You could, you know, get the other authors on the paper to perhaps send an agreed common email that reiterates the guidelines. It's not that you're taking the person on from your own view. You say, you know, we want to be aware that there's some international guidelines that this journal explicitly commits to, and we want to raise some concerns or want to make some points about how we think about who should be an author on the paper. So you could almost leverage the journal's commitment to those guidelines, perhaps, to do that rather than yourself. And if there are other co-authors doing it as a team, could be another way to do that. But I understand the problem. And I've been fortunate that I haven't suffered from this too much in my own career, but people do. And I don't think you want to be putting yourself in an additionally vulnerable position, particularly if you want to have an academic career, because there's too much at stake in that. So I think, yeah, be careful in how you do it, but don't suffer in silence. But yeah, this is something to read around and to talk with other people about, because it is a problem that the field needs to address. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, thanks for that, Mikey. All right, well, we're running quite over time now, but we'll take one last question that I see Alex Hinga has just posted. It says, for papers that combine empirical evidence with ethics analysis, what are your strategies for ensuring a good balance between describing the empirical study context, methods and results, and making ethical arguments?
Good question, Alex. A really hard question, and one that probably requires its own very long discussion, but it's hard. I think it's really hard to write up empirical bioethics papers that both seek to produce empirical insights and to make novel ethical arguments. There is a chapter in a book that I co-edited with some colleagues, which is called Empirical Bioethics, Theoretical and Methodological Perspectives, I think. And there's a whole chapter on writing up empirical bioethics of that kind that I would recommend you have a look at. I can send you the reference. If you drop me an email, I'll send you the reference directly to you. It's hard I find it personally very hard to publish these papers that do both of those things in bioethics journals, because the word count is so limited. I mean, you want to be accounting for your methodology, which is usually quite different to other standard methodologies, describing your methods, presenting your data, whilst also in an integrated fashion presenting the arguments. And of course, that's really complicated to do in a short time frame. My advice would be to look at some papers which have tried to do that. And again, I can send you a couple of examples if that would be helpful, or send them to Dina to circulate more widely. But everybody struggles with that. And there aren't a natural home for that really sophisticated, more integrated empirical bioethics work. And yeah, it's a difficult challenge. It's also a type of empirical bioethics that might push against a little bit this idea of having a findings and a discussion and a conclusion section, because you might want to present arguments, for example, and use the data, weave it around the arguments that you present. So it might also push back against the sort of standard structure I talked about as well. Yeah, I'll send the references to Dina and hopefully she'll circulate them. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Mikey. I'm sneakily going to quickly ask you my question, which was very quickly, at what point do you give up? How many rejections, how many journals should you submit to and get rejections from before you decide, okay, this paper is not going anywhere? Or should you just keep trying?
I think you should keep trying. I think it depends on how much you believe in the paper. So, I mean, when I've given up, it's because I've realized that the paper itself wasn't good enough. And my heart's not in revising it to make it do what I wanted to do. And the reviews have just shown me something I already knew deep down, which was the paper just doesn't deliver. And I'm not really that committed to it. But if you are committed to it and you think the paper does make an important contribution, there's no need to give up. Just go through every single journal if you need to. And there's no point in giving up because the peer review system and the way editors make decisions is not uniform, nor is it in any sense, it's the best way to put this, foolproof. You'll get accepted eventually. And I know people who've had papers rejected 10, 12 times and had the paper finally published. So don't give up unless you want to give up.
All right, that's good to know. Okay, well, thank you so much, Mikey. This has been really useful, full of good points, lots of thoughts for us to take with us. I will circulate the PowerPoint slides and the book reference that Mikey mentioned. And yes, and then the recording will be put up on our YouTube playlist. So thank you so much, Mikey, and thanks you for running over time and answering questions.
It's a pleasure. It's my own fault for not delivering a concise talk. Sorry about that, everybody. But it's been great to meet you all, and I hope to see you in person at some point as well in the future. Good luck with your work.